Laramie Basin, Wyoming Territory, October, 1887. When Alara Vogel began dragging the rust-pocked carcass of a derelict locomotive boiler across her homestead, the territory thought she had finally surrendered to the prairie madness. Men stopped their wagons on the rutted track to watch the slight woman, braced against the high plains wind, single-handedly wrestling 3 tons of oxidized iron with a system of levers, rollers, and sheer unyielding will. They saw a woman building a monument to foolishness. Silas Croft, a man whose hands had framed half the cabins in the county, spat a stream of tobacco juice that froze before it hit the ground. "A fire belongs in a hearth, Mrs. Vogel," he called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who had never been wrong about the physics of survival. "Not in an iron lung you mean to put inside your house." But Alara Vogel wasn't building an iron lung, nor was she courting disaster. She was building a memory, and when the great blizzard of '88 descended, a storm that would be spoken of in whispers for a century, that memory would prove to be the difference between a family thriving in shirt sleeves and a family freezing in the dark, a difference measured in a staggering 97 degrees. The high-altitude sun did little to soften the bite of the wind. It was a thin, clarifying light that made the distant Medicine Bow Mountains seem close enough to touch, their peaks already shrouded in the brilliant, menacing white of the coming winter. Alara ignored the gawking men. Their judgment was another form of weather, predictable and something to be endured, not engaged. Her focus was on the immense steel cylinder, its rivets like steel knuckles, its firebox door gaping like a silent mouth. To her, it wasn't scrap. It was potential. It was a vessel. In the shipyards of Hamburg, where she had learned her trade, she had worked with steel plates twice this thick, riveting the hulls of great steamships meant to conquer the Atlantic. She understood the immense contained power of steam and the quiet, persistent strength of hot water. She knew how metal held and transferred heat, not with the explosive, inefficient radiance of an open flame, but with a deep, pervasive wellness that could travel. Her husband Thomas emerged from the newly built cabin, his face a mask of worry and loyalty. He was a good man, a carpenter whose skill with wood was as profound as hers was with metal. He had built them a fine, tight home of lodgepole pine, the gaps chinked with a mixture of clay and grass until the walls were nearly monolithic. He trusted his wife's mind, but he could not ignore the weight of community opinion. "Alara," he said, his voice low. "Silas is watching. Jedediah Mills just rode past and called it Vogel's Folly." Alara paused, wiping a grease-stained hand across her forehead, leaving a dark smudge in its wake. She looked at the cabin, then at the boiler, and then at her husband. Her gaze was not defiant, but deeply certain. "Folly is building the same fireplace that failed you last winter, and the winter before that," she said, her German accent softening the hard edges of the words. "This is not fear, Thomas. This is physics." She turned back to her work, securing a chain around the boiler's midsection. The sound of the tightening links was the only reply she offered to the whispers on the wind. The men on the track eventually moved on, shaking their heads, securing the story they would tell at the general store that evening. The story of the peculiar German woman who was either going to blow her family to kingdom come or freeze them solid with her bizarre iron contraption. They laid their bets, and not a single one was placed on her success. If you find yourself captivated by the stories of those who dared to think differently, who trusted physics over folklore, consider subscribing to our channel. We explore one forgotten frontier technique every week, proving that the simplest solutions are often the most revolutionary. Let us know in the comments the coldest winter you've ever had to endure. The mockery, once seeded, grew with the tenacity of prairie grass. It started as murmurs and became a communal sport. Jedediah Mills, a man whose voice was as loud as his opinions were unburdened by evidence, held court in the Laramie General Store, leaning against a barrel of salted pork. "I'm telling you it's an octopus," he declared, to the guffaws of the assembled ranchers and homesteaders. "Saw it with my own eyes. She's got pipes running out of it like tentacles, straight through the walls into every room. Calls 'em radiators. Looks more like a disassembled pipe organ. The iron octopus, that's what it is." The name stuck. It was cruel and visual, and it perfectly captured the alien nature of Ilara's creation. Soon, no one referred to the Vogel homestead without mentioning the iron octopus that squatted in its heart. The criticism wasn't limited to folksy nicknames. It came from all corners, each skeptic armed with their own brand of certainty. Silas Croft represented the voice of experience. He visited the Vogel homestead under the pretense of checking on Thomas's chinking work, but his eyes were drawn to the boiler, now installed in a small, stone-lined alcove off the main room. Ilara was fitting lengths of 1-inch iron pipe to its outlets. "Mrs. Vogel," Silas began, his tone patient, as if explaining the world to a child. "I've built 47 structures in this territory. A chimney draws smoke up and out. A hearth throws heat forward. It's a design that's worked for 1,000 years. What you're doing here, you're trapping the fire. You're putting a cap on it. It won't breathe. It'll choke itself out on its own smoke, filling your house with fumes." He was pointing to a fundamental misunderstanding. He saw the boiler as a sealed fireplace. He didn't see the carefully constructed flue separate from the water jacket that would draw air from a dedicated external vent, breathe it into the firebox, and exhaust it straight up through a narrow, efficient stovepipe. Her fire wouldn't breathe from inside the house, stealing precious warm air. It would breathe from the outside. Then came the voice of institutional authority. Mr. Abernathy, the crisp, formal agent from the Union Pacific Land Office, stopped by to finalize their deed. He saw the network of pipes and the looming boiler, and his pen hovered over the paperwork. "This setup is not in any manual I've ever seen," he said, his disapproval as starched as his collar. "The railroad recommends a standard stone hearth or a pot-belly stove for residential structures. This is irregular. The company can't officially endorse a heating system that could, shall we say, depressurize unexpectedly." He didn't say the word bomb, but the implication hung in the air, thick as coal smoke. The cruelest cut, however, came from family. Thomas's brother Samuel, who had a homestead 5 miles downriver, came for Sunday dinner. He saw the finished system, the cast-iron radiators painted a simple, dignified black, sitting demurely under the windows in each of the cabin's 3 rooms. He drew Thomas aside. His voice was laced with pity, not anger, which made it worse. "Thomas, you know what this looks like to everyone? It looks like you don't trust your own work. It looks like you built a cabin so drafty your wife had to invent this machine to make it livable. People think you're putting your family in a death trap." That night, the weight of it all finally pressed down on Thomas. The cabin was quiet, the children, Annalise and Jakob, asleep in their small room. The heating system was cold, waiting for the true winter to arrive. "Ilara," Thomas whispered in the dark, "it is hard to be the town story. It is hard to have my own brother look at me with such pity." Ilara turned to him, her face illuminated by a sliver of moonlight. She took his calloused carpenter's hand in her own, her fingers tracing the map of scars and old wounds. "In Hamburg, I watched them build the iron ships," she said, her voice soft but resonant. "The old men who only knew wood, they laughed. They said iron cannot float. They said it was a coffin for sailors. They trusted what they had always seen. They did not trust the math. They did not trust the water to hold what the math said it would." She squeezed his hand. "I do not trust the wind, Thomas, but I trust the water. Water holds the memory of fire, and it will carry that memory into every corner of this house for us. Let them talk. Winter will tell us what is wise and what is foolish." Thomas said nothing, but his grip tightened. He chose to trust his wife over the wisdom of the world. The system Elara Vogel built was a masterpiece of repurposed ingenuity, a testament to the cross-pollination of knowledge from one industry to another. What the homesteaders saw as a bizarre collection of scrap was, in reality, a sophisticated closed-loop hydronic heating system, operating on a principle so elegant it required no moving parts: the thermosiphon. The heart of the system was, of course, the locomotive boiler. It had a water capacity of nearly 80 gallons, a massive reservoir for thermal energy. She had spent weeks cleaning it, patching 2 small leaks with a brazing technique she'd perfected in the shipyard, and sealing the firebox. Critically, she built the firebox so it was fed air from a 6-inch pipe that ran under the floorboards directly to the outside. This was the first revolutionary act. A conventional fireplace was a voracious parasite. To feed its combustion, it would suck in cubic feet of air from the room itself, air the inhabitants had already spent precious fuel to warm. This created a constant chilling draft as cold outside air was pulled in through every crack and gap to replace what the fire consumed. Elara's firebox breathed the outside air, leaving the warm, sealed envelope of the cabin undisturbed. The cold didn't care about tradition. It cared about air pressure. From the top of the boiler, a 2-inch iron pipe rose vertically for 3 feet before turning to run, at a slight upward angle, along the ceiling toward the far end of the cabin. This was the supply line. Hot water is less dense than cold water. As the fire in the boiler's belly heated the surrounding 80-gallon water jacket, the water would expand and rise, naturally flowing up and along this elevated pipe without any need for a pump. This was the engine of her system, gravity itself. In each of the 3 rooms, the main living area, the kitchen, and the children's bedroom, a smaller pipe dropped down from the main supply line into a radiator. These were her proudest creations, forged from salvaged materials that others had deemed worthless. For the children's room, she used a series of interconnected cast iron gear casings from a broken piece of farm machinery, their fins providing an enormous surface area. For the kitchen, she welded together a manifold from lengths of heavy-duty pipe left over from a railroad water tower project. As the hot water flowed down into these radiators, it released its stored thermal energy into the metal, which in turn radiated a gentle, consistent warmth into the room. This was not the scorching, front-side hot, backside cold heat of a fireplace. It was a pervasive ambient warmth that filled the entire space. Having released its heat, the now cooler, denser water would sink to the bottom of the radiator. From there, a second pipe, the return line, carried it back toward the boiler, running along the floor at a slight downward angle. This cooler water would re-enter the boiler at its lowest point, displacing the newly heated water and forcing it up, continuing the silent, ceaseless, gravity-powered cycle. The iron octopus was a circulatory system for the home, with the boiler as its heart and water as its lifeblood. The physics were undeniable. Water has a specific heat capacity over 4,000 times that of air by volume. This means a gallon of water can absorb and store vastly more heat than a gallon of air. While her neighbors were constantly trying to heat the air in their cabins, air that was being sucked up the chimney or leaking out through the walls, Elara was heating a massive, stable thermal battery of 80 gallons of water. Once that water was hot, it stayed hot for hours, circulating and releasing its warmth long after the fire in the firebox had been banked to embers. She had decoupled the act of burning wood from the act of staying warm. One evening, as a preliminary cold snap descended, Thomas watched her fascinated as she explained the final piece of the puzzle. "The placement is everything," she said, pointing to the radiator beneath the window in Annalise and Jacob's room. "Silas would say that's the worst place, the coldest spot. He would put the fire on the warmest wall." She shook her head. "But the radiator here creates a curtain of warm air that rises. It meets the cold air sinking from the glass and neutralizes it before it can cross the room. It stops the draft where it is born." Thomas looked from the radiator to his wife, a sense of awe dawning on him. He was a master of the tangible world of wood and joints, but she was a master of the invisible world of pressure and heat. "I don't understand all of it," he admitted, "but I see it now. You are not just making the house warm. You are telling the heat where it must go." Elara smiled, a rare, full smile. She placed her hand on the iron flank of the boiler, already humming with a low, latent heat from the small fire she'd lit. "Stone holds embers," she said, her voice quiet and sure. "But water holds the memory of fire." It was her singular piece of poetry, an encapsulation of a truth so profound her neighbors couldn't even begin to see it. They saw a bomb. She saw a memory bank for warmth. If this idea of storing and moving heat is changing how you think about staying warm, take a moment to like this video. It tells us we're on the right track. And stay with me, because the numbers that came out of this cabin during the worst blizzard in American history are nothing short of astonishing. The first flakes began to fall on the afternoon of January 12, 1888. They were small and dry, skittering across the frozen ground. No one thought much of it. Snow was a constant companion in a Wyoming winter, but by dusk, the wind began to rise, not as a gust, but as a steady, malevolent force, a planetary exhalation that seemed to originate from the Arctic itself. The temperature, which had been a brisk 10 degrees Fahrenheit at noon, began to plummet. By nightfall, it was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, it was minus 36 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was screaming at over 60 miles per hour. The great blizzard had arrived. It was later called the school children's blizzard for the tragic toll it took, but for the homesteaders of the Laramie Basin, it was simply the crucible. Inside the Vogel cabin, the world was transformed. The gale howled outside, a physical pressure against the walls. But inside, there was a profound stillness. Elara's external air intake meant the cabin was not fighting a constant battle against vacuum. There were no drafts. A candle placed on the floor near the door. The very spot where a gale would normally shriek through burned with a steady, unwavering flame. Thomas sat at the table repairing a leather harness, while Annalise and Jacob played a game of checkers on the floor. They were in their shirt sleeves. The air was a consistent, comfortable 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Elara had stoked the firebox with 4 stout logs of seasoned pine before dinner. The 80 gallons of water in the boiler were now a reservoir of heat, circulating silently through the pipes, the radiators emitting a steady, gentle warmth that filled every corner of their 800-square-foot home. The children's bedroom, furthest from the fire, was 64 degrees Fahrenheit. A bucket of water on the floor 10 feet from the boiler showed no signs of freezing. The windows were clear, with only a delicate filigree of frost at the very edges. 3 miles away, the scene inside Silas Croft's expertly built cabin was one of controlled desperation. His massive stone fireplace, a monument to traditional craftsmanship, was roaring, consuming wood at an alarming rate. Yet its heat was a lie. It was a fierce, localized blast. If you stood within 5 feet of it, your front was roasting while your back was freezing. His wife, Mary, had hung blankets over the doorways to the other rooms, effectively shrinking their world to a single 200-square-foot space. The temperature 10 feet from the fire was a mere 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The children's bedroom was 29 degrees Fahrenheit, and they were huddled in their parents' bed under a mountain of quilts. Every 30 minutes, Silas had to bundle himself in his heaviest coat and fight his way through the shrieking wind to the woodpile, which was shrinking at a terrifying rate. The fire, in its hunger for air, was pulling the killing cold into the house through every tiny gap in his otherwise perfect construction. The contrast was stark. The Vogels burned a quarter of a cord of wood over 2 days. The Crofts burned nearly a full cord. In the Mills cabin, the situation was even worse. Jedediah Mills, a man of bluster, not foresight, had a smaller, less efficient potbelly stove. By the second morning of the storm, with the outside temperature holding at a steady minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit before wind chill, his family had retreated to the kitchen, stuffing rags into the door frames. Their water barrel, 5 feet from the stove, was frozen solid. The gut-punch detail that would haunt Jed for years came that afternoon. With his woodpile exhausted and buried under an 8-foot drift, he began to burn his furniture. First a broken chair, then a crate, and finally, with tears freezing on his cheeks, he took an axe to the hand-carved poplar cradle his own father had built, the one that had held all 4 of his children. He was destroying his past to survive the present. On the evening of the second day, a figure appeared at the Vogels' door, a ghost caked in snow and ice. It was Silas Croft. He didn't knock so much as collapse against the door. Thomas threw it open, and the cold that blasted in felt like a physical blow. Silas stumbled inside, his beard a solid mass of ice, his face pale and drawn. And then he stopped. He stood in the middle of the room, swaying slightly. The warmth hit him not like the blast of a fire, but like stepping into a different season. It was a complete, enveloping, impossible presence. It was in the air. It radiated from the walls. It rose from the floor. He looked at Thomas in his simple wool shirt. He saw the children, not bundled and shivering, but playing calmly. He saw the clear windows, the steady candle. His eyes, the eyes of an expert builder who had never been wrong, scanned the room, taking in the impossible reality. He saw the pipe running along the ceiling, felt the silent heat pouring from the radiator under the window. He walked over to it and placed a bare hand on its surface. It was deeply, wonderfully warm. He turned slowly, his gaze falling on Alara, who stood by the boiler, her expression calm, unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet and profound certainty. Silas's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blizzard howled, but inside the small cabin, the only sound was the gentle ticking of a clock on the mantel. He looked from Alara to the intricate network of pipes, the heart of the iron octopus he had mocked. The mockery lasted for a season. The validation would last a lifetime. He finally found his voice, the words raspy and low, stripped of all their prior authority. He didn't offer an apology or an excuse. His admission was simpler, more profound. He looked at the system, then back at Alara. Silence. Show me how you built it. The blizzard broke on the third day, leaving behind a world of sculptural, terrifying beauty. The landscape was buried under drifts 20 feet high, the sky a painful, brilliant blue. The human cost was slowly tallied, a grim accounting of homesteaders caught unprepared, of children who never made it home from school. But in the small community around the Vogel homestead, a different kind of accounting was taking place. Word of Silas Croft's refuge at the Vogels spread faster than a prairie fire. It wasn't just that he had survived there. It was the details he shared, his voice filled with a craftsman's awe. He didn't speak of miracles. He spoke of physics. The temperature outside my door was minus 42 degrees, he told a stunned gathering at the general store a week later. Inside her cabin, it was 65. Uniform, no drafts. I took my own thermometer. I measured it twice. He described the children in their shirt sleeves, the unfrozen water bucket, the impossibly small amount of wood they had burned. He had walked in a skeptic and walked out a convert. The most respected builder in the county had publicly, unequivocally, admitted his error. The transformation was immediate. The name Iron Octopus was never spoken in mockery again. Now, it was a term of respect, of curiosity. Men who had laughed at Alara now approached Thomas with a new deference, asking questions, trying to understand. Samuel Vogel arrived, his face etched with shame and wonder, and formally apologized to his brother and sister-in-law. "God forgive me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I nearly talked you out of building the one thing that kept you truly safe." That spring, a quiet pilgrimage began. One by one, then in pairs, homesteaders came to the Vogel cabin. Alara, patient and methodical, would show them the system. She never gloated. She simply explained the principles: the external air feed, the thermosiphon effect, the strategic placement of the radiators. She drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, explaining water's thermal capacity in simple, yet direct terms. Thomas helped with the construction aspects, showing them how to frame the boiler alcove and seal the pipes where they passed through the walls. By the fall of 1888, Silas Croft, working from Alara's design, had installed a similar system in his own home, using the boiler from a wrecked threshing machine. 3 other families followed suit that year. The next year, it was a dozen more. They called them Vogel heaters. The innovation spread not through any formal plan, but through the quiet, powerful network of shared experience. It spread because it worked. The memory of the Great Blizzard was a powerful catalyst for change. The cold hadn't cared about tradition or opinion, it had cared only about thermal dynamics. Alara Vogel never sought fame or fortune for her invention. Her reward was the safety of her family and the quiet satisfaction of seeing her knowledge take root in the unforgiving soil of the frontier. Her children, Annalise and Jakob, grew up in a house where winter was not a season to be feared, but a time of quiet comfort and security. The principles she demonstrated of sealed combustion, thermal mass, and gravity-fed circulation were a century ahead of their time, anticipating the core tenets of modern, energy-efficient heating design. She had seen the future not in some grand vision, but in the practical, observable truths of the world around her. She knew that innovation isn't about complexity, it's about a deeper understanding of the simple, unyielding laws that govern our world. True wisdom, like true warmth, does not announce itself with a roar, but spreads quietly, pervasively, until it fills every available space. If you enjoyed this story of frontier ingenuity, please subscribe and join our community. We have many more stories to share. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Disclaimer: this is a fictionalized account inspired by historical principles of early hydronic heating. The characters and specific events are products of imagination, but the engineering concepts are real. Always consult modern building codes and certified professionals for any construction.